With housing prices increasing and the cost of living skyrocketing, it's important now more than ever to be able to find ways that we can reduce those expenses as much as possible. In my previous video, I talked about the three biggest expenses that people have, which is housing, food, and transportation. Housing being the biggest one, making up typically 33% of people's budgets. In this video, I'm going to talk about the number one way that we can reduce our housing payment, or sometimes even eliminate it entirely, and that is through house hacking. House hacking can allow you to reduce or even entirely eliminate your largest expense, so it's definitely very worth it. And it's also a great intro into real estate investing, which I'm a big fan of. You might be wondering what house hacking is. When you hear that, it probably conjures up some image of some guy just sitting there like on a laptop, like hacking into somebody's house, but that's ridiculous. In this video, I'm going to go over why I believe that house hacking is hands down the best option when it comes to saving money and earning more. If you've read the book Rich Dad Poor Dad, like a lot of real estate investors have, you know that a house is not necessarily an asset. An asset is something that makes you money every month, whereas a house typically tends to cost you money, and therefore it is a liability. House hacking is all about taking that liability and turning it into an income-producing asset. You get the flexibility of renting with the benefits of home ownership, and then you also don't have a liability that's costing you money every single month. So before we go into house hacking, I want to talk about some of the common mistakes that people make when they are buying a house. And the first one is buying the most expensive home that they can qualify for. So if you go to the bank and they pre-approve you for a mortgage, they say you can buy a house that's worth $500,000. That's the maximum that you can get. That doesn't mean you should go out and buy the most expensive house that you can possibly get. Just because you can technically make those payments every month, it's going to really stretch you to your financial limits, and you want to try to avoid that as much as possible. Another mistake that people make is that they'll buy a home that's a little bit more reasonable. So say you're approved for 500 and they get a house that's 300K. But the thing with that is that you still have those monthly expenses, so it's still costing you money every month. That's still better than the first scenario, but it's not ideal, and it's still going to prolong your quest to financial freedom. And then another mistake that people make is buying without an exit strategy, right? We just want to get a house right now. We don't think about what are we going to be doing 5-10 years down the line, maybe a little bit sooner or a little bit later. We don't think about that, and what that can do, that can really end up costing us a lot of money later on, right? Because you have no idea what you're going to want to do in 5 years. Maybe you want to move to a different city, you want to move somewhere else, and just buying a house, just buying any house you can find that you personally like, might not be the best option. So I think the smarter way to buy a house is to buy a house that you're happy to live in right now, but also might potentially work as a rental later on in the event you want to move and rent it out. So at least then it's not costing you money every month. Another good way to buy a house is buying something that has a value add opportunity. Maybe the basement isn't finished and you can just slowly, while you're living there, make some improvements to it and increase the value, so that then maybe in a couple of years you want to sell it, you can then sell it at a profit. However, I think the smartest way to buy a house is house hacking, and that's buying something that works as a rental right now and then also living in one of the units to cover the expense of living there, because you have to live somewhere, right? So for example, if I buy a duplex property that has 2 units, I live in one of the units and I rent out the other one to a tenant, and then that income that he's paying me is helping cover the expenses of living there. This will significantly reduce the amount of money you're paying every month to live there. It might even completely eliminate it if you break even, and there is even some cases where you can actually make money off of it. Let's say, for example, that a property has 2 units and each unit has 2 bedrooms in it. The mortgage is $2,000 a month on it, and the additional expenses, so taxes, maintenance, insurance, and so on, are another $1,000 a month. So it's costing you $3,000 a month to own this property. And let's say the market rent is $1,600 for each unit. So they're identical units, and each one would rent for $1,600 a month. If you rented out both of them, you'd essentially profit $200. After all your expenses are paid off, you have $200 left over. And then if you live in one of the units, it's essentially as if your rent is $1,400 a month. That's the money that's coming out of your pocket every month to own the property. So the $1,600 chips away at that $3,000, and then you have $1,400 that you are left over paying. So right off the bat, you've already significantly reduced the amount that it costs you to live in that home. And then you can take it a step further. Maybe you rent out that other bedroom that you have free, you rent that out to a friend, or you just put an ad up for it and you rent that out to somebody, and now that reduces your expenses even more. So you rent that out for $500 and now you're only paying $900 every month to own that property. So the reason I like this so well is that you have the flexibility of renting with the benefits of owning a home, and then you also have a rental property that's generating income. In this case, now if you decide after a year you no longer want to live in that property, you want to move somewhere else, you can rent it out and you can be cash flowing that property $200 a month while you live in a different house. And maybe you buy a different house hack and you do it again. And I don't even necessarily have to live in the house either. So say in my first example where each of the units rents for $1,600, If I go and I rent a comparable unit somewhere else that is about $1,600 a month in rent and I'm profiting $200 off my first property, then I'm essentially only paying $400 for that rent because the income from that one is covering $200 of that first expense. And then not only that, my loan is being paid down by the current tenants, and I also have a property that's gonna go up in value. The reason why I think this is such a powerful strategy for buying a house is that it allows you to dramatically decrease the amount that you're spending on your housing expense per month, and you now at the same time have an income producing asset that you have the potential to profit off of long term. Now the good thing with house hacking is that you can do it multiple times. You can, once you move out of the first one, you can purchase a second house hack and then continue living for a very reduced rate, and then maybe after a few years you decide you want to do it again, and then you can keep doing it and just leapfrogging from one to the next, and then you'll eventually have a pretty sizable portfolio of rental properties. And then if you keep doing it, you keep accumulating more and more of these properties, you'll eventually get to the point where all of your expenses are covered by the rental income, and now you're financially free. Another reason why I think it's a really good idea, especially if you want to get into real estate investing and buying your own rental properties, is that it lets you build some experience as a landlord while you're actually living on the property. So you don't have to be worrying about driving back and forth to the property all the time. If there's any problems to deal with, you're just right there to deal with it. And again, you don't necessarily have to buy a duplex or a multifamily property. It can be done with any sort of property. There's a bunch of different ways you can go about doing it. For house hacking, you're just buying a rental property and you're living in one of the units or one of the rooms. It's important to view a house hack as an investment, not just a house purchase. So typically the house purchases that we make are made on the basis of emotion and whether or not we like it. With a house hack and real estate investing in general, we're viewing it on the basis of what is the return on investment that we have here. So you want to focus on something that works as a rental property on its own that will actually generate income if you were to rent it out entirely. So you'd want to look at what the market rents are and like how much you're paying for it, and like, will the rents actually cover all the expenses? And you want to don't just factor in the mortgage, you also have to factor in taxes, maintenance, insurance, utilities, and then any vacancies and any other additional expenses that come up. So if you're interested in actually purchasing a house hack, there's a couple things you want to ask yourself before is, what can I actually afford? You want to look into how much you can actually get pre-approved for, and then how much like house you can actually buy, and then is the house going to work as a rental property on its own even if I wasn't living there? That's the biggest thing, because remember, we want to also have the flexibility to be able to move away and still rent out that house without having to worry about staying there or selling it or doing anything like that. If you just buy a house on the basis of what you personally enjoy, you might have some issues when you try to go rent it out later. Another thing you might need to ask yourself is, how am I going to finance this? Like, say if you don't have enough money, if you live in a particularly expensive area, you don't have enough money for the down payment on the property, you might be able to engage in a joint venture where you are going in on the house hack with somebody else. So say you have a friend who is interested in doing it as well. You guys live in one of the units as roommates, and then you rent out the other unit, and then you just split the equity 50-50, or however you want to structure it. There's a bunch of different ways you can go about it. You probably have some friends that are interested too. If they're roughly around the same age as you, it'd be worth talking to them, maybe discussing it with some people. Another particular way you could do is just private money. Like if you know anybody that you know that's willing to maybe lend you the money, that could be another way to go. So there's a couple different ways to go into that. I'll probably make another video at some point talking about real estate financing, but just for right now, just know that there is some options there and you might have to get a little creative with it. So I think another very important question to ask yourself, especially when you're house hacking a place, is, am I willing to personally live in this property? I think that's a good question to ask yourself when it comes to buying any rental property, because if you wouldn't live in it, chances are other people wouldn't either. And if it's a complete slum, it's going to be a lot harder to find people that actually want to live there. And if you do find somebody that wants to live there, they're probably not going to be paying you very much in terms of rent. So if you find a place that isn't in the greatest condition, that's fine, because you always have the option to fix it up a little bit, which will increase the amount of rents you're able to get, but it'll also increase the value of the property overall. And then you can refinance it later on and then use that to purchase additional properties or just invest it elsewhere. Another question to ask yourself is, where will I actually buy my house hack? If you live in an area where it's very hard to find properties that are going to generate rental income, then maybe that's not the best area to buy in. I think a good rule of thumb to have when buying a house hack is to buy where the money is and then rent where you want to live. So if you want to live in Toronto, for example, it's very hard to find a property that is going to generate income, then maybe you buy yourself a rental property in Brantford or Hamilton or St. Catharines or wherever it is you are currently located. I'm in Southern Ontario, obviously. That will then cover some of your expenses of renting in Toronto. So yeah, you don't necessarily have to live in the house that you're house hacking. You can use the rental income from that to cover some of your expenses of living elsewhere. So remember, first and foremost, you're buying an investment property here. So you almost want to treat yourself like you are one of the tenants, and the amount that you're paying is going to be your rent. Now, house hacking can be difficult, especially because it requires more money up front than, say, renting does. But just like any form of real estate investing, I think the reason a lot of people are hesitant to get into it is because it requires quite a bit of upfront capital. Whereas like with stocks or crypto, all you really need is maybe a couple $100, maybe even less than that in order to get started. But with real estate, you might need tens of thousands of dollars. So that's why I'm really big on reducing your expenses as much as possible. And then that'll allow you to save up even more. And then you can really get your feet wet with some real estate, which I think is where the real money is made. So I'm currently trying to, do you mind? So I'm currently trying to acquire my own house hack, and that's something that I'm excited to document here when I actually do. I think it's one of the best ways to grow your wealth over time because it allows you to simultaneously decrease your living expenses, which again, housing is the biggest expense that we all have. And then it also allows you to build up your portfolio of rental properties that are gonna allow you to increase the amount of money you're making every single month and eventually achieving financial freedom. Where's another really stupid spot I can put this? All right, so if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.